Do humans need ecosystems? And if they do, how and in what ways? So the quintessential metaphor used to describe ecosystem services is building a society in outer space. So if you wanted to recreate everything humans would need to survive, what would you bring with you? First, you think of the obvious things. You'd need food and water. But you pretty quickly start to realize that you need a lot more than that. How will, for instance, your wastewater be cleaned? How will you get the oxygen you need to breathe? How will plants be fertilized? So you'd need to ask these and hundreds of other similar questions that you need to find answers. So the bottom line here, this thought experiment leads us to understand that we need an enormous array of ecological functions to survive. And these functions that support human life have been called ecosystem services. So around the turn of the millennium, 2000, hundreds of scientists and practitioners all around the world got together to assess two things: how humans around the world depend on ecosystems and the state of those services the ecosystems were providing. And these scientists and practitioners wrote a massive report and called it the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And the summary for decision makers of this document is one of the readings for this session. So around this time, the term ecosystem services came into reasonably wide usage. So let's make sure we understand that term. So ecosystem services are commonly understood as the benefits ecosystems provide to people. Said another way, ecosystem services are the mechanisms through which ecosystems contribute to human well-being. So I'll say a little bit more about that human well-being in a moment, but for now, I'll talk about the fact that these ecosystem services have been broken down in a number of ways. We'll use the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment's typology or breakdown because it's the most well-known and commonly used. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment described, and again, this is based on consultation with hundreds of scientists and practitioners all around the world, 4 types of ecosystem services. And these fall into regulating ecosystem services. These are things that regulating ecosystem functions. So things like climate regulation or water purification, where we get our clean water. The next type is provisioning ecosystem services. These are things like food and fiber, actual physical materials we get from ecosystems. The third kind is cultural ecosystem services, and these are intangible or non-material ecosystem services, things like spiritual value or recreational value. And the last type of ecosystem services is a little different, so put it in a different color, and that is supporting ecosystem services. And these are functions that underlie the top 3, the sort of more immediate 3 forms of ecosystem services. So those are things like nutrient cycling and primary production. So again, I want to emphasize that ecosystem services, here in the middle of this diagram, are the connection between ecosystem processes and human well-being. That's the fundamental point about ecosystem services. They're a way of thinking about ecosystem processes, framing them in terms of human well-being. So this means that for the ecosystem services field, human well-being is a big, important topic. In order to study ecosystem services, we have to define human well-being and then figure out how to measure it and how to improve it. So we won't get into all of the details because that's a whole additional lecture or 2 or 3 or 10. But I will say that most typologies of well-being include some aspect of education, access to education, and the ability to be an engaged citizen. They include these, education and engaged citizenry, or some permutation of those, as a critical aspect of well-being. And those 2 topics are clearly related to environmental education. So here we get into the connection between ecosystem services and environmental education. So this diagram is very confusing. There's a lot going on. The main point I want to make here is it's sort of analogous to that more simplistic diagram a bit ago, in that on the left we have ecosystem services, and on the right we have constituents of well-being. And one reason I wanted to put this up here and let you look at it is to understand that environmental education has a lot to do with a lot of these aspects of well-being. So freedom of choice and action, opportunity to being able to achieve what an individual values doing and being. Education is really wrapped up in those values. So a few more notes on how environmental education is connected to ecosystem services. Another point about environmental education is that environmental ed is about making the environment relevant to people. Ecosystem services is also fundamentally a concept designed to make the environment relevant to people. Anybody, anywhere, making the point that we need ecosystems to survive. So that's a really strong connection. It's all about making the environment relevant, connecting to people's everyday lives and to people's what is meaningful to people. In addition, many people would say that environmental education is about encouraging discussion and reflection about the complexity of the human relationship with the environment. That's also what ecosystem services is all about, encouraging a deeper understanding of the human relationship with the environment. So ecosystem services is one way of doing that. A third big connection to environmental education results from the increasing attention that ecosystem services are getting regionally, nationally, and globally. So the ecosystem services are increasingly discussed in many decision-making forums. They often play a role, for instance, in global decision-making processes about conservation, and particularly conservation and development. So when environmental education wants to interface with these global efforts, understanding and figuring out how to incorporate ecosystem services makes a lot of sense. And the last point that I'll make about the relevance to environmental education is what I personally still think is an area of research, a really exciting one, and that is considering how looking at the non-human world in terms of ecosystem services changes how we think about it. So that's an educational question. That is, how does learning about ecosystem services, so in other words, a form of environmental education, learning about ecosystem services, change what we value and perceive of our surroundings and how we prioritize our actions related to our surroundings? That, to me, is a central environmental education question very intricately related to ecosystem services. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. I hope this brief introduction to ecosystem services and their relevance to environmental ed has been helpful and interesting. I look forward to your insight in the online forums.